Whole Foods CEO John Mackey doesn't think we need healthcare. All we need to do is buy his products and we'll be fine. This article was published on CNBC by Kat Clifford. The one thing you should assume about John up front is that he wants the best for Americans. He doesn't want to selfishly exploit anybody. He wants win-win-win. Just ask him. You can tell right off the bat. Whole Foods CEO John Mackey says the key to keeping people healthy in the United States is for people to eat better and live healthier lives. What could be more obvious? I mean, honestly, we talk about healthcare. The best solution is not to need healthcare, Mackey told Freakonomics radio host Stephen Dubner in an episode released on November 4th. The best solution is to change the way people eat, the way they live, the lifestyle and diet, Mackey says. There's no reason why people shouldn't be healthy and have a longer health span. A bunch of drugs is not going to solve the problem. Americans are not taking as good care of their own bodies as they ought to be, Mackey says. 71% of Americans are overweight and 42.5% are obese. Clearly, we're making bad choices in the way we eat, he says. It's not a sustainable path, and so I'm calling it out. It's not the first time Mackey has called for better lifestyles as a solution to expensive healthcare. So let's look to New York Times Magazine, The Extraordinary Science of Addictive Junk Food by Michael Moss. On the evening of April 8, 1999, a long line of town cars and taxis pulled up to the Minneapolis headquarters of Pillsbury and discharged 11 men who controlled America's largest food companies. Nestle was in attendance, as were Kraft and Nabisco, General Mills and Procter & Gamble, Coca-Cola and Mars. Rivals any other day, the CEOs and company presidents had come together for a rare private meeting. On the agenda was one item: the emerging obesity epidemic and how to deal with it. While the atmosphere was cordial, the men assembled were hardly friends. Their stature was defined by their skill in fighting one another for what they called stomach share, the amount of digestive space that any one company's brand can grab from the competition. I'll break in here and say that I have a good friend who has a sister who's a food scientist, and her job is not to make food more healthy, it's to make it more addictive. And she's told her brother that the bigger the customers become, the bigger the profit margins. Obese customers drive profits. As long as you don't quite kill them, everything's great. So all these companies that we've learned to trust, Nestle, right? Flint, Michigan, Nestle, Kraft, Nabisco, General Mills, Procter & Gamble, Coca-Cola, and Mars, we trust them to take good care of us, right? Wrong! We trust them to exploit us like every other corporation. Some of these huge corporations produce products that cause cancer, and at the same time, they create other products that treat cancer, not cure cancer, but treat cancer. It's a beautiful money circle. So back to John Mackey, he says we just need to make better decisions. Maybe a better decision would be to construct guillotines for all these assholes. He seems to think he's taking the high ground because his food is healthier. I wonder how he'd feel about legislation that ended monopolists altogether. Now, he'd probably rather make legislation that demanded people eat his products. He'd probably want to tax them if they consumed products from his rivals. Make no mistake, John Mackey is no better than these other CEOs. He just wants to make his slice of pie bigger than everyone else's. Whether or not he argues for win-win-win, he's lying through his teeth. Here's a tweet from Freakonomics. John Mackey, the CEO of Whole Foods, says that modern capitalism accepts too many trade-offs. He instead proposes a different model that he calls win-win-win. Good for you, good for me, good for all of us. Do you think this type of model is possible? Sounds like he's proposing that instead of modern capitalism, we need to tell consumers what to choose. That's very libertarian of you there, John. Let's just tell people what they have to eat. In 2009, he penned a piece for the Wall Street Journal along the same ilk, the Whole Foods alternative to Obamacare, in which he advocated for less government control of healthcare in the United States. You know, though, I don't think he'd mind government intervention in healthcare if the government intervened by saying that he didn't have to pay for healthcare. It's a dog-eat-dog world out there. It's every man, woman, and child for themselves. Why should the government get involved? Here's a good Mackey quote. This begins with the realization that every American adult is responsible for his or her own health. That's why you want to tell them what to eat, right? We should take that responsibility very seriously and use our freedom to make wise lifestyle choices that will protect our health. I think we should make wise lifestyle choices that end all of these food company monopolies. All of these monopolists, though rivals, are quite willing to work together to fuck us. John does not give even half a fuck about our health. John's controversial op-ed caused some to boycott Whole Foods. Well, I'll tell you, I don't buy anything from John Mackey. The story continues. While it is true that poor diet can lead to dangerous and expensive health conditions, according to a 2019 New York Times op-ed, cardiovascular disease costs $351 billion annually in healthcare spending and lost productivity, while diabetes costs $327 billion annually, and it's critical to improve. It's not enough, says Nadera Purat, a professor and the director of the Health Economics and Evaluation Research Program at the UCLA Center for Health Policy Research. The idea that if people look after themselves and have a healthy lifestyle, it will improve their health is a fundamental concept, and many public health interventions are designed to educate individuals to do exactly that, Purat tells CNBC Make It. That said, there are other factors that lead to disease and determine the need for healthcare, such as genetics, adverse life events, exposure to chemicals, etc. And there are things like the pandemic currently going on. These food monopolies cause a lot of exposure to chemicals, especially if you live anywhere near Flint, Michigan. So the public health perspective is to also have a capable and effective healthcare system that can provide services to screen for disease or risk factors, e.g. cancer screening, provide preventative services, e.g. flu shots, and provide treatment when needed, Purat says. And while Mackey recommends behavioral changes, it sounds like he's recommending forced behavioral changes as the optimal fix for ballooning healthcare costs. Whole Foods provides full-time employees access to health insurance. However, Whole Foods announced that in 2020, part-time employees who work less than 30 hours a week would no longer be eligible to buy into the company's healthcare plan. Wow, John, that sounds like win-win-win to me. At the time, a Whole Foods representative said the change would affect less than 2% of its employees and that Whole Foods would work with employees to find alternatives. Probably they should just take him out back and shoot him, right, John? We wouldn't want your healthcare costs to go up. I don't know if any of you have ever had a psychopath boss like this guy. One of the most endearing things they do is work themselves to death or do other things they think you ought to be able to do, and they say, look, I can do it. That means you should be able to do it too. I used to work for a boss who worked 20-hour days, and he thought it was just fine then to demand other people to do the same. Hey, I'm willing to make these lifestyle choices, therefore I feel that I should be able to obligate you to make the same choices. Mackey, 67, himself is a vegan who meditates daily and monitors his own behaviors to make healthful changes. Isn't that nice? I see how long I slept. I see the quality of my sleep. I see what my pulse rate was for the whole night, Mackey told Dubner. Anytime I drink any alcohol at all, my deep sleep almost completely disappears. I don't sleep as long, my pulse rate goes up. So my body is trying to metabolize this alcohol, and I had no idea. I think he's trying to tell us all that we should stop drinking alcohol. John Mackey, the prohibitionist. I do think there are good healthcare system models that work, Mackey said, pointing to Singapore, where individuals pay for routine care and insurance is used for large costs. That sounds like win-lose to me, though, because it's designed to benefit the big corporations at the expense of its workers. You know, though, I'm not so against win-lose as long as assholes like John Mackey are the ones who lose. I'm fine with that. And then he mentions Switzerland, where he says people buy insurance from private nonprofits. But in America, we're not looking for the win-win-win solutions. We're looking for win-lose solutions. My way or the highway. What he doesn't like is people like Bernie Sanders telling him he needs to change. And then he says it's created a lot of anger, a lot of disappointment, a lot of frustration. Are you angry, John? Do you have disappointment? Are you frustrated? Poor baby. I'd like to tell you, John, every day I wake up, I'm trying to make your life worse. Every day, every hour, every minute, I'm trying to make your life worse. Actually, I'm trying to take you and your ilk out of existence. I don't think there ought to be billionaire company owners and multi-million-dollar CEOs. I just don't think you should exist. And now let's return to the story about Julian Assange's extradition hearing. We now know that Judge Baretzer granted Julian a stay of execution, but recent news from Richard Medhurst is that they've denied his bail, but due to his mental health and not due to the merits of his case. The door is still wide open for the United States to quash whistleblowers and to quash dissent of every kind. The last thing a fascistic nation like the United States wants is journalistic freedom. So we turn to Glenn Greenwald. The Kafkaesque imprisonment of Julian Assange exposes U.S. myths about freedom and tyranny. The real measure of how free is a society is not how its mainstream, well-behaved ruling class servants are treated, but the fate of its actual dissidents. So we don't want people who eat too much or dissent politically. Hey, as long as the CIA is happy, I'm happy. How about you? A billboard van calling for an end to extradition proceedings against WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange waits at traffic lights in Parliament Square in London, England on September 14, 2020. Persecution is not typically doled out to those who recite mainstream pieties or refrain from posing meaningful threats to those who wield institutional power or obediently stay within the lines of permissible speech and activism imposed by the ruling class. That was a good opening sentence. Those who render themselves acquiescent and harmless that way will, in every society, including the most repressive, usually be free of reprisals. They will not be censored or jailed. They will be permitted to live their lives largely unmolested by authorities, while many will be well rewarded for this servitude. Such individuals will see themselves as free because, in a sense, they are. They are free to submit, conform, and acquiesce. And if they do so, they will not even realize, or at least not care, and may even regard as justifiable, that those who refuse this Orwellian bargain they have embraced, freedom in exchange for submission, are crushed with unlimited force. I've been seeing a lot of this attitude from the comfy Dems on my Facebook feed. Those who do not seek to meaningfully dissent or subvert power will usually deny because they do not perceive that such dissent and subversion are in fact rigorously prohibited. They will continue to believe blissfully that the society in which they live guarantees core civic freedoms of speech, of press, of assembly, of due process, because they have rendered their own speech and activism, if it exists at all, so innocuous that nobody with the capacity to do so would bother to try to curtail it. The observation apocryphally attributed to socialist activist Rosa Luxemburg, imprisoned for her opposition to German involvement in World War I and then summarily executed by the state, expresses it best. Those who do not move do not notice their chains. The metric to determine whether a society is free is not how its orthodoxy spouting, well-behaved, deferential to authority citizens are treated. Such people are treated well, or at least usually left alone, by every sovereign and every power center in every era all over the world. You will not feel the sting of Silicon Valley or other institutional censorship as long as you affirm the latest COVID pronouncements of the World Health Organization and Dr. Anthony Fauci, even as those decrees contradict the ones they issued only a few months earlier, but you will if you question, refute, or deviate from them. You will not have your Facebook page deleted if you defend Israeli occupation of Palestine, but will be banished from that platform if you live in the West Bank and Gaza and urge resistance to Israeli occupying troops. If you call Trump an orange fascist clown, you can stay on YouTube for eternity, but not if you defend his most controversial policies and claims. You can vocally insist that the 2000, 2004, and 2016 U.S. presidential elections were all stolen without the slightest concern of being banned, but the same claims about the 2020 election will result in the summary denial of your ability to use online tech monopolies to be heard. Censorship, like most repression, is reserved for those who dissent from majoritarian orthodoxies, not for those who express views comfortably within the mainstream. Establishment Democrats and Republicans, adherents to the prevailing neoliberal order, have no need for free speech protection since nobody with power would care enough to silence them. It is only the disaffected, those who reside on the fringes and the margins, who need those rights, and those are precisely the people who, by definition, are most often denied them. Similarly, powerful officials in Washington can illegally leak the most sensitive government secrets and will suffer no punishment, or will get the lightest tap on the wrist, provided their aim is to advance mainstream narratives. But low-level leakers whose aim is to expose wrongdoing by the powerful or reveal their systemic lying will have the full weight of the criminal justice system and the intelligence community come crashing down on them to destroy them with vengeance and also to put their heads on a pike to terrorize future dissidents out of similarly stepping forward. Journalists like Bob Woodward, who spend decades spilling the most sensitive secrets at the behest of the ruling class DC elites, will be lavished with awards and immense wealth. But those like Julian Assange, who publish similar secrets but against the will of those elites with the goal and outcome of exposing rather than obscuring ruling class lies and impeding rather than advancing their agenda, will suffer the opposite fate as Woodward. They will endure every imaginable punishment, including indefinite imprisonment in maximum security cells. That is because Woodward is a servant of power, while Assange is a dissident against it. All of this illustrates a vital truth. The real measure of how free is a society, from China, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt to France, Britain, and the US, is not how its mainstream, well-behaved ruling class servants are treated. Royal court vassals always end up fine. Rewarded for their subservience and thus convinced that freedoms abound, they redouble their fealty to prevailing status quo power structures. Ding, ding, ding! That's how the urban, suburban, comfy, neoliberal, Republican, and Democrats act. You need to do what the police tell you. They won't give you any trouble unless you're a criminal. Back to the story. Whether a society is truly free is determined by how it treats its dissidents, those who live and speak and think outside of permissible lines, those who effectively subvert ruling class aims. If you want to know whether free speech is genuine or illusory, look not to the treatment of those who loyally serve establishment factions and vocally affirm their most sacred pieties, but to the fate of those who reside outside of those factions and work in opposition to them. If you want to know whether a free press is authentically guaranteed, look at the plight of those who publish secrets designed not to propagandize the population to venerate elites, but instead those whose publications result in generating mass discontent against them. That is what makes the ongoing imprisonment of Julian Assange not only a grotesque injustice, but also a vital, crystal-clear prism for seeing the fundamental fraud of U.S. narratives about who is free and who is not, about where tyranny reigns and where it does not. Assange has been imprisoned for almost 2 years. He was dragged out of the Ecuadorian embassy in London by British police on April 11, 2019. That was possible only because the US, UK, and Spanish governments coerced Ecuador's meek president Lenín Moreno to withdraw the asylum extended to Assange 7 years earlier by his staunch sovereignty-defending predecessor Rafael Correa. We mentioned both of those actors in this play a couple of days ago. The US and British governments hate Assange because of his revelations that exposed their lies and crimes, while Spain was enraged by WikiLeaks' journalistic coverage of and activism against Madrid's 2018 violent repression of the Catalan independence movement. So they bullied and bribed Moreno to throw Assange to the wolves, i.e. to them, and ever since Assange has been held in the high-security Belmarsh prison in London, a facility used for terrorist suspects that is so harsh that the BBC asked in 2004 whether it is Britain's Guantanamo Bay. And you wonder why Julian considers suicide hundreds of times each day. Assange is not currently imprisoned because he was convicted of a crime. 2 weeks after he was dragged out of the embassy, he was found guilty of the minor offense of skipping bail and sentenced to 50 weeks in prison, the maximum penalty allowed by law. He fully served that sentence as of April of this year and thus was scheduled to be released, facing no more charges. But just weeks before his release date, the U.S. Justice Department unveiled an indictment of Assange arising out of WikiLeaks' 2010 publication of U.S. State Department diplomatic cables and war logs that revealed massive corruption by numerous governments, Bush and Obama officials, and various corporations around the world. That U.S. indictment and the accompanying request to extradite Assange to the U.S. to stand trial provided, by design, the pretext for the British government to imprison Assange indefinitely. A judge quickly ruled that Assange could not be released on bail pending his extradition hearing, but instead must stay behind bars while the UK courts fully adjudicate the Justice Department's extradition request. No matter what happens, it will take years for this extradition process to conclude because whichever side, the DOJ or Assange, loses at each stage, and Assange is highly likely to lose the first round when the lower court decision on the extradition request is issued next week, they will appeal, which is what they did, and Assange will linger in prison while these appeals wind their way very slowly through the UK judicial system. That means that, absent a pardon by Trump or the withdrawal of the charges by what will become the Biden Department of Justice, Assange will be locked up for years without any need to prove he is guilty of any crime. He will have been just disappeared, silenced by the very governments whose corruption and crimes he denounced and exposed. Those are the same governments, the US and the UK, that sanctimoniously condemn their adversaries, but rarely their repressive allies, for violating free speech, free press, and due process rights. These are the same governments that succeed largely due to a limitlessly compliant corporate media that either believes the propaganda or knowingly disseminates it for their own rewards in convincing large numbers of their citizens that, unlike in the bad countries such as Russia and Iran, these civic freedoms are guaranteed and protected in the good Western countries. The ample evidence showing that the indictment of Assange is the single gravest threat to press freedom in years, and that the arguments mounted to justify it are fraudulent, has been repeatedly documented by myself and others, so I will not rehash those discussions here. Those interested can see the article and video program I produced on this prosecution, along with my op-ed in the Washington Post, Laura Poitras's New York Times op-ed last week on the indictment, former Brazilian President Lula da Silva's Guardian op-ed calling for Assange's immediate release, the editorial from The Guardian and column from the Washington Post's media reporter Margaret Sullivan condemning this prosecution as abusive, and statements from the Freedom of the Press Foundation, the Committee to Protect Journalists, Columbia Journalism Review, and the ACLU warning of the serious dangers to press freedoms it poses. I'm going to let you read all but the last 4 paragraphs of this piece, and I hope you will, because details of this story are not readily available to mainstream media consuming citizens. We've discussed Edward Snowden before, so I'll pick up in Glenn's story where he brings up Snowden. Snowden's asylum in Russia, the only thing standing between him and decades in a high-security cage in the U.S. for the crime of revealing unconstitutional spying by Obama officials, is similarly scorned in elite U.S. media and political circles as something shameful and even treasonous, rather than a perfectly legal shield under international asylum conventions against persecution by the vengeful and notoriously repressive U.S. security state. Where will you hear this angle on mainstream media, particularly MSDNC and Clinton News Network? Here we see the blinding propaganda to which U.S. citizens are endlessly subjected. Asylum is always warranted when extended by the U.S. government to dissidents or outcasts from inferior countries, but it is never warranted when granted by other countries to U.S. dissidents or other journalists and activists whose punishment the U.S. seeks. This warped formulation is potent because the U.S. media succeeds in peddling the toxic mythology that the U.S. has unique rights and entitlements that lesser countries do not, because unlike them, the U.S. is a freedom-loving democracy that honors basic human rights and steadfastly guarantees fundamental civil liberties of free expression, a free press, and due process to all peoples. The next time someone makes that claim, explicitly or otherwise, tell them to look at the fate of Julian Assange, one of this generation's most effective journalists and activists in exposing the crimes, deceit, and corruption of key U.S. power centers, particularly its permanent security state. Assange is not even a U.S. citizen, having spent a week total in his life on U.S. soil and having absolutely no duties, legal, journalistic, or ethical, to safeguard U.S. secrets. That is so fucked up. But no matter, anyone who effectively challenges U.S. power must and will be crushed. That is because freedom of speech and press and other civic guarantees are granted only to those who refrain from meaningfully challenging the U.S. ruling class. That is, to those who do not need those rights. Those who do need those rights, those who dissent and are disaffected, are denied them, definitively proving that these rights exist only on parchment, that in reality they are artificial and illusory for those who actually need and deserve them. Probably the highest honor humans can achieve in the world, at least as it has existed for the last 100 years, is to be assassinated by the CIA. Most of our very best people have met this end. If Jesus had been around in modern times, you can be sure that he would have met this fate.